Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to the session on security and privacy challenges for digital currencies. My name is Vijay Mauree, and I lead the Digital Currency Global Initiative Secretariat in the Standardization Bureau at the ITU. This is the second session of the security thematic track of the DC³ conference from cryptocurrencies to CBDCs, organized by the ITU in collaboration with the Future of Digital Currency Initiative of Stanford University as part of the activities of the Digital Currency Global Initiative. I'm joined today by our panelists, Daniel Benarosh, Director of Research, QEdit and zkproof.org. Mr. Paul Lloyd, Cybersecurity Strategist from HPE and also the Vice Team Leader of the Security and Assurance Working Group of the Digital Currency Global Initiative. And Mr. Scott Carlson, Director of Global Architecture and Strategic Development, Head of Digital Asset Security at Kudelski Security. So this session today is a bit like looking a bit ahead in the future, like up to 2025, and discuss, what would be the security and privacy challenges that could be faced, by the implementation of various types of digital currencies, from CBDCs to stable coins and cryptos. So the session will provide an overview of the current technology risk landscape, as well as explore, what are the measures, including cryptography measures and progress towards quantum safe digital currency systems. So each panelist will have a 15 minutes for presentation. And this would be followed afterwards by a Q&A session where the audience can also provide their questions. So before we start, just to remind the audience, you have the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen, and we invite you to type your questions in the Q&A window, and the panelists will respond to them during the session. So I'd now like to invite our first speaker, Mr. Daniel Benarosh from QEdit to deliver his presentation, which will look at security and privacy challenges for CBDCs and stablecoins. So Daniel, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Vijay. And to all the IC3 or IC³ and the ITU team for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think first of all, the whole world of privacy and CBDC is quite exciting. We're only seeing sort of the beginning of it, but it's definitely important to maintain. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of those considerations and what it means. So as Vijay said, I'm a director of research at QEdit, a company building products based on privacy enhancing techniques, and the lead organizer of zkproof.org, an effort to standardize zero-knowledge proofs. So let's just start first by understanding what is the importance of privacy in blockchain. Right? As you know, right, very, very briefly, blockchains are not actually private by default. There is kind of an understanding that blockchains are pseudonymous, but they're not anonymous, right? Like the fact that transactions can be read and linked by anyone and through their kind of transaction chain means that anybody can see what's going on and can de-anonymize the identities. You even have tools like Etherscan, for example, that help you actually see what is in different accounts and what are the transactions. For example, here I'm just showing, one of Coinbase's, the US exchange, one of Coinbase's addresses holds sort of $24 million and, in Ether and $33 million in 120 other tokens, right? So you can see very much all the details. Now, what is important here is not to highlight sort of what happens in each blockchain and whatnot, but it's sort of what are the pros and the cons of having this kind of transparency. First of all, the pros are that, of course, it's more difficult to hide criminal activity or fraudulent behavior, and those that have tried many times have ended up being caught. And of course, governments can audit these blockchains to track the well-being of the system, right? If we think about it in context of CBDC, for example, based on blockchain. On the other hand, we have the cons of this, which basically mean that people can take advantage of public data to identify users or monetize some of that data that should be private. And of course, we have the idea that validators of these blockchains, as kind of this decentralized consensus-based mechanism, can kind of what's called front run the transactions, meaning that they can add their own transactions before the one that they see coming, right? In a way, maybe taking a better deal on an exchange or leveraging some, position of liquidity providers or something like this. Won't get into much more into the details of this, but the question is, what if there existed a tool that actually provided the best of both worlds, right? Like this is kind of what is needed for a CBDC, and I'll mention this explicitly in a second, where what we want is sort of for users to have all this system that they can trust, or that they don't necessarily need to trust because the mathematics takes care of the integrity of the system, and that can keep their data and the transactions completely private. And on the other hand, we want to have this system that, sort of the authorities, the government, or the central banks can actually, ensure, at least to a certain degree, and maybe even with lower costs and friction, that the users are behaving properly, right? That there is no fraudulent behavior. And so cryptography can actually unlock both of these things by unlocking the value of applications while providing the privacy and kind of ensuring that trust is not an issue in interactions. And also cryptography can enable kind of these checks or prevent certain fraudulent behavior even before it gets to the point of detection, like even at a preambular state. So that would be amazing. And in fact, this is kind of what we call today privacy enhancing techniques. And I'm going to review very briefly kind of 4 of them, which I think are the most interesting for today's applications. The first one, you may have heard of zero knowledge proofs. This is essentially a tool that enables kind of verifying the integrity of a computation when there is someone that has some data and wants to compute some function over this data. And it proves the outcome of this computation while maintaining the data private. Today, it's used mostly on blockchain scalability and transaction privacy. And actually can unlock auditability today. So if we think about a CBDC in the future, governments could essentially audit financial behavior through zero knowledge proofs by having users generate proofs of this specific behavior that is expected of them. Maybe a transaction that was sent wasn't sent over $10,000, while not having to necessarily show what the transaction actually was, right? Or maybe we can prove that the transaction that we just received comes from a chain of, not fraudulent tokens, or, not money laundered funds. In terms of multi-party computation, so this is another tool. This is kind of a holy grail in cryptography. It actually enables computation on data that is distributed. So if we have several parties and each one has different data that they want to keep private, then multi-party computation allows, through some interaction, computing an outcome out of all the data, but without actually revealing that data, right? Today, it's very useful because it allows proper private key management in the context of blockchains. As we know, this is one of the issues, that users are now owners of their funds because they own a kind of a private key around these addresses. Specifically, it allows you to do multi-signature or key recovery. And in CBDC, it can even enhance further applications. If we think about, for example, decentralized exchanges today, well, today they happen because they are mostly transparent. Like on the Ethereum blockchain, the market is made through verifying all the asks and bids. Whereas in a private scenario, you would essentially need something like a multi-party computation to understand exactly and to get an integrity of what the market price is based on all the supply and demand, right? Then we have homomorphic encryption, which basically enables computations in the cloud to happen on private data. So essentially, the computations actually happen on encrypted data, and the output when sent back to the user and is decrypted, you get the actual same result you would have if you had sent non-encrypted data to the cloud, which is quite amazing. Today, it's used mostly for basic statistical aggregation because of the fact that it's still not fully efficient to use. But there are several companies in the space building libraries and products for doing machine learning on private data, right? If we think about, for example, the health industry, I mean, Google got into some trouble not long ago because of this, because of trying to analyze data, health data of patients that didn't necessarily consent to it, or that had different kind of regulation aspects to this data. So this machine learning could essentially be computed on encrypted data without revealing that. And in the context of CBDC, well, it would be interesting to think about how to compute a credit score, for example, without revealing all the financial data. Where users that hold the data and the credit scoring company or the insurance company has a risk scoring function that they do not really want to reveal. And this would be one way to solve it. And then we have differential privacy, which is essentially a tool that adds kind of a lot of randomness to data set and then allows it to compute certain macro results, like overarching results on the data set, without revealing specific individuals' data. And if you usually have a data set, what happens is that the ends of the data set can reveal a lot of information about those individuals, because they tilt a lot the different parameters of the statistics. Today, it's actually being used in the US Census, for example, and also in Mozilla Firefox to collect information from the users without necessarily understanding what the individual usage is. And again, in CBDC, it can be used sort of for governments or authorities to keep a kind of high-level overview of what the transaction usage is, or what the financial system looks like. And this could be very useful for the well-being of the system. And essentially, like this is kind of needed. These tools are needed to kind of unlock the full value of CBDC and stablecoins. So as I was trying to say earlier, CBDC needs certain properties in order to really truly succeed. The first one is kind of that it needs to be a censorship resistant system, meaning that if we have an authority that built this system, well, we don't want the authority to be able to tamper with the system. We don't want the authority as users to change the rules of the system without going through the kind of appropriate governance process, right? Like going through, lawmaking and so on. This is also getting a little bit into the kind of the world of what the security aspect of building these things means, because we're talking about the code and it needs to be audited. Users shouldn't just trust code, and that goes as well for the blockchain space in general. Then we want it to be trustless, to have trustless interaction, meaning that if I'm going to be, sending transactions to Vijay and to Scott and to Paul, well, I don't want these interactions to have to think about whether I trust the person on the other end, right? I want to only basically trust the fact that I reviewed the code, or that the code is safe, and that's enough for me to know that the math will do the job. Of course, for this, it's really important to have standards in place. And of course, this is one of the main jobs of ITU. And as I said earlier, zkproof.org is also in this space. Then we have that, of course, as we said, we want the privacy of transactions and data. This is extremely important to have a well running system that has mass adoption. Because if you've heard of many stories in Venmo, where basically people are sending money to their friends and saying exactly what the reason for that money was in the concept. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a social platform, and then everybody can just see what was the purpose of these transactions. We wanted to have kind of a unique user identification. In this context, what we call in the blockchain space is that it should be a federated system instead of just an open system, like, for example, Bitcoin or Ethereum, where you can actually have many identities that are unlinked to each other. Here, we definitely need some kind of onboarding for that. And I will mention exactly why that is in the context of identity, because identity is going to be a core aspect of a proper and well-functioning private CBDC. And of course, from the context of the authorities, we needed to have for the system to preserve integrity and prevent fraud, and also to allow for auditability of the behavior, maybe for certain asset types, maybe for regulation that is specific to, for example, stock markets and derivatives, and of course for the purpose of tax payments, right? We don't want people to start evading taxes just because there is a digital infrastructure that seems to be more useful. And of course, when I say identity here, there is a lot of it behind it. But if we think about what identity means in the digital world, well, of course, that's a whole 2-hour presentation in itself. But essentially, we want to be able for a government system to have a single identity onboarded, as I said earlier, in a way that still transactions are not linkable. So to anybody looking at the blockchain that is not, say, the authority or a regulator, the transactions are not linkable, and nobody can identify the specific addresses or the identity of the people in these transactions. And this also goes to the fact that the content of the transaction and not only the addresses should be private, as well as all the data generated. If we are building applications on top of this CBDC, right, like it could be an exchange, or like it could be stock market, we still don't want the privacy, the data that is generated in those interactions, to be public, and potentially not even stay at the application provider, right? Kind of changing a little bit the way that the systems work today. And still, we would like to give the ability to, say, an authority be able to de-anonymize specific transactions based on behavior that is considered fraudulent, right? And this would kind of what it would generate. The way it would work is it would generate certain triggers based on a proof that didn't verify correctly, or a computation in homomorphically encrypted that didn't necessarily pass a threshold on the result, et cetera, et cetera. But these are kind of the main important points to consider for what an identity looks like in a federated CBDC system. And again, with all this is to say that some of the schemes in these privacy enhancing techniques field are today usable for many applications, actually, and I think for CBDC they are really ready to be used. There is still a lot of research going on and innovation, which also sort of means that standards are kind of at this edge of the balance, where you want to freeze some scheme in time for people to start using it and adopting it widely, but at the same time you don't want to stifle innovation, right? And all in all, again, it's important to understand that as much as the mathematics here is what counts and what is ensuring the security, we still need to have defined systems for reviewing the scheme's security itself, like the proofs of security for the mathematics behind it, as well as several experts and auditors reviewing the code for these systems. Because we know that the biggest vulnerabilities come from human-made systems and human mistakes. In that sense, also, one of the main aspects we need to consider is how does the usability of these systems look like? What is the kind of product or user experience perspective we can add and innovate on? Because this is kind of different from the more traditional systems that we've been used to. So I'm very excited to engage in the conversation with the rest of the panelists in the Q&A. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for sharing your thoughts on the privacy enhancing techniques and how this would be applied to digital currencies like stablecoins and CBDC. So let's move now to our next panelist. So I'd like to invite Mr. Paul Lloyd from HPE and also Vice Team Leader of the Security and Assurance Working Group of the Digital Currency Global Initiative, to share a bit now the work that he's leading under the the cryptography work stream in the Security and Assurance Working Group. So Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, obviously there's nothing more important to cryptocurrency than cryptography. Nothing more foundational. And especially when we look at the future of digital currencies, it's good to ask yourselves, all of us interested in this space, 3 questions. I'm going to go through all 3 of them here relatively quickly at a relatively high level, but I hope that it gets the point across. And the first of this question is simply this: what is the quantum computing threat to classic cryptography? If we go on to our next slide, please, then let's make sure we really kind of understand the importance of what we call classical cryptography as opposed to quantum cryptography and anything quantum related. But fundamentally, there are a handful of cryptographic primitives that are just foundational to digital currency systems. Kind of by definition, we don't have digital currency without things like digital signature or public key encryption or key exchange and key agreement mechanisms. Those are the things upon which we build cryptocurrencies. They work just fine today in the classical world because we have identified, we as mathematicians and cryptographers, that community have identified a number of what are called hard problems that we can use for these algorithms. Integer factorization is one. It's the RSA kind of thing. Discrete log in a finite field, kind of classic Diffie-Hellman, or discrete log on an elliptic curve, just elliptic curve cryptography. Mathematicians and computer scientists have called these hard problems because, as computer scientists and mathematicians, no one has been able to produce algorithms for classical computers that can effectively solve these problems, especially solve these things in acceptable timeframes. So as computers have gotten faster, we've increased key sizes, a bit here, a bit there. The result is that the bad guys, with all the computing power they may be able to bring to bear, aren't going to break those keys. If we go on to the next slide, please, then we notice that quantum computers are a threat to that. They change it. Why? The reason is because algorithms have already been designed, since the 90s timeframe, for a while now, in advance of quantum computers themselves, that demonstrate that these problems are no longer hard when we have viable quantum computers. Phrased a bit more to the point and directly, quantum computers will break some of the classic algorithms upon which cryptocurrencies have been built today. Furthermore, for other cryptographic algorithms that are widely used in cryptocurrencies and elsewhere, quantum computers will make attacks against them much easier. They're not broken. We have ways to deal with it, but the problem gets worse. What does it all come down to? When we look at the future of digital currency, to me, it's as simple as this last point here. We must prepare now for a post-quantum world. Next slide, please. So let's talk about that viable quantum computer impact a bit more here in our second question. What would a viable quantum computer mean today for existing cryptocurrencies, the stuff we know and love today? Next slide. Well, here's a high-level perspective to kind of get our heads around it from the top there. Any currency today that's based upon traditional classic cryptographic primitives that rely on these classically hard problems will be at some level of serious risk. It's kind of unavoidable. Details will matter, but the risk is going to be there at some level in some sense. Ranking them by Bitcoin versus Ethereum versus whatever would be an exhaustive technical deep dive. But there are a few things worth highlighting to help us understand how nuanced the situation can be and how important it is that we prepare now. Because that's the message I want to leave you with is, let's just begin preparing. Next slide. Let's look at digital signatures based on elliptic curve, because that's a real pervasive thing that we see today in cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin, you name it, there's probably an elliptic curve digital signature in there somewhere. An attacker today with a viable quantum computer today could forge digital signatures if given an actual public key, because that algorithm is broken. When a quantum computer can run an algorithm that knows how to do things like factorization, or in this case here, its equivalent in an elliptic curve. Now, so that means that if a cryptocurrency truly exposes a public key, then it will face things like forged digital signatures. If that digital signature authorizes spending one's digital currency, then we have a catastrophic situation. Bad guys they own your wallet. If owning the wallet means the ability to exercise a transaction on your public key, that public key is out there for the bad guy to bring his quantum computer to bear on, boom. That bad guy is you. Your wallet is a bad guy's wallet. It's a bad situation. However, not all cryptocurrencies expose public keys. Some cryptocurrencies do things like compute your wallet address, the thing that's publicly kind of visible, at least most of the time, by a one-way hash to the public key. That's a tougher problem. A bad guy who has a one-way hash of your public key is not going to bring one of these super quantum computer algorithms to bear on it. And that's good. But at some point in time, if it's truly based upon a digital signature, there has to be a public key exposed. And that means that in the age of viable quantum computers, the exposure is there. There are things that we can do to limit that exposure, like cycle key pairs after use them one time and throw them away. Those can all help. And there may be, there is work in progress in some of the various cryptocurrencies today to incorporate these sorts of approaches. Some cryptocurrencies have incorporated them from the start. That's a good thing. But long story short, it's a tough problem for today's cryptocurrencies when it comes to digital signatures based on liquid curves, some much tougher than others. Next slide, please. It's considered proof of work based on a hash function, a very common thing today in our cryptocurrencies. So anyone with access to viable quantum computers today has an immediate advantage over those who do not. Not because quantum computers have broken hash functions, but because they have made them much, much more efficient. Okay. And that gives them advantages as miners. If cryptocurrency is mined based upon proof of work, then obviously someone who can do that mining more efficiently has an advantage over others. Now, we could argue that in the real world, everybody will just converge on the quantum computers, and that's probably true over time. But it's at least very, very disruptive. It's a risk. It is a threat in my estimation. And the worst case of that, if it just went to kind of the end of the spectrum, it could be as far as a 51% attack, where someone got there first. They had the resources, the funding, whatever you want to call it there, to be well ahead of the rest of the environment, the rest of the ecosystem, miners on access to viable quantum computers at scale. 51% attack comes into play as an arguable risk. Next slide. So what's the message here? Don't panic. Now, hopefully, as I went through that, you didn't get the impression that I'm a sky is falling guy or a gloom and doom guy, or it's all over, these existing cryptocurrencies are dead in the water in a couple of years. Because that's not the message. I want to stress that because it's the important part of the message. It's not a panic thing that we want to do. It's a plan thing we want to do it now. In the work that I do, in the working group that Vijay mentioned, is we prepare for a post-quantum future. We kind of want to go into this digital currency thing from the start as we're planning its future and tell ourselves that, great, we have things that exist today as cryptocurrencies. We know them, we love them. But when we think about central bank sorts of digital currencies, other sort of emerging digital currencies, why don't we make them quantum safe from the start? That's the message here. Next slide. How far away are these viable quantum computers? That's probably a good question to ask at this point, since on the one hand, we've identified that it breaks things, and on the other hand, we said, well, it breaks them kind of sort of depending on what you are, and maybe we just want to plan. Well, if nothing else, this tells us the time frame for that planning. Next slide, please. A good way to look forward on this, in my estimation, my opinion, is to look back at the past year, 2021. And some cool things happened in that time frame. In February, we had IBM's 5-year roadmap. And while I'm not going to go into horrible details quite yet here, let's just say that it's very ambitious. We'll see some more details in a bit there. But it's very aggressive work, and it's work on which they've made progress. It's cool stuff. In April, we had DARPA announce their quantum benchmarking program. I think that's important because it kind of shows the maturity of it in a sense. It kind of shows the interest it's getting and the need for people to do things like, hey, we need to start really treating it as real. I'll leave it at that. That's my interpretation, but I think it's a valid interpretation. We saw a big merger in June of Honeywell Quantum Solutions and Cambridge Quantum Computing. Again, I think it's important to mention in the same spirit as the DARPA that it shows consolidation, it shows things happening. It's not just lab stuff and academic stuff. These are real world things we're seeing as quantum computing becomes real. And to use that word viable again, these are the kind of things that we see as the technology becomes viable, as it matures and it enters the real world. In July, we had 66 qubits. If you're not a quantum computing geek, then a qubit is the analog to a classic binary bit. It's how quantum computers operate. It's the bit that is not just a 0 or 1, not to go too sideways. Data apparatus called Zhuangzi, and it achieves 66 qubits. And if you're not a quantum computing person, that's actually a very, very impressive achievement. Topped in November when IBM's Eagle achieved 127 qubits. So point being that compared to where the state of the art has been and real quantum computers have been, this is powerful stuff. This is impressive stuff. If we go on to our next slide, then what does he tell us about the future? Because that's what we care about here is what does the future look like? Well, IBM's roadmap, there's a roadmap again for 2022, is targeting 433 qubits with their Osprey platform. And a year later, they get to over 1,000 qubits with Condor. Looking a few years ahead to say the end of the decade timeframe, IBM and others are targeting million qubits. And million qubits is scary to a classic crypto person like myself, maybe some of you. Million qubits is when you say to yourself, you know what? My classic stuff is assumed to be broken. Bad guys can do bad things. So next slide, please. What is this all again? Where's that message again? It's the same message. In the case of this time frame for viable quantum computers, what I would want you to take away today is that the exact dates are not important. I'm not going to give you a date and say it's March of 2026 that the world ends, or it's August of 2032 the world ends. That's kind of missing the point entirely, in my estimation, and in the work that we're doing in my working group. It's all about looking at very recent evolution, the roadmaps, the maturity of the industry, and realizing that exact dates don't matter. What matters is that we accept that viable quantum computers will likely be here within the next decade. And the fact that it likely will happen, and will happen before or in the same time frame as broad adoption of things like central bank digital currencies, is all it takes. Reality bites, but we have to accept it. We need to influence our thinking today, assuming that in the time frame of rolling out central bank digital currencies and similar sorts of future digital currencies, that they need to be quantum safe. And so we need to plan, and we need to plan now. Notice there are a couple of questions. A question from countries without quantum computers should adopt a central bank digital currency. I think any country should pursue digital currency as they think they need to do. I would only amplify the message back to any such country that as they do it, assume that viable quantum computers will exist in the next few years, probably in their time frame, where they need to at least be worried enough to adopt a central bank digital currency in a post-quantum safe manner. Abandon the algorithms that we know break, adopt quantum safe algorithms from the NIST or from ETSI or from other standards bodies, and move on. Move on to your digital currency future. Hopefully that's what the question was trying to flesh out. And with that, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for sharing the the different threats that quantum computing pose to digital currencies and also to the blockchain. Thank you also for not predicting the quantum apocalypse and for saying we can still plan for it. And I think that's what you're doing right now in the Security and Assurance Working Group. So hopefully for the next edition of the DC³ conference, we can hear a bit more from you on what is it that we need to do. So now let's move on to our next panelist, Scott Carlson from Kudelski Security. So Scott, I'd like to give you the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One thing that I specialize here at Kudelski Security and that we do as Kudelski Group is we help make sure systems are safe to use, that they're built right, that they're built with integrity, and that you can trust them. When you take a look at the whole foundation of a CBDC, if we centralize digital money, if this system is going to be where people's livelihood is, wouldn't we want it to be, roughly the safest thing on the planet? And so when we think through that, how do I build it right? How do I design it right? And then ultimately, what kind of things do I do as a security audit or assessment to make sure that is actually doing the things that it says, that it's actually safe to use, or at least, as safe as the risk tolerance shows that it needs to be. And so I want to be clear that, what I'll be talking today about is mostly the technical assessment side of things, as well as some of the maybe more traditional security flows around, confidentiality, integrity, availability. A security assessment, when you bring in somebody who is looking at your system like they want to prove that it's safe, they want to make sure it keeps the data private, it keeps the data available only to those who should see it, right? That's the confidentiality side. On the integrity side, nobody can change it. Suddenly you have $1 million more, that shouldn't happen, or $1 million less. It should enforce the integrity. And the integrity thing, I think, is a big question around the quantum, is that it could affect the integrity, or heck, even the confidentiality, availability of all of these systems. Availability is less a traditional cyber thing, but some people consider things like denial of service attacks and the availability of accessing your funds a security problem. And when you think about, a centralized digital currency, it has to be available all the time. When you need to transact 24/7, 365, like it cannot take a day off. But there's some other sort of maybe more squishy areas around security assessments. Is it safe to use? Is it legal to use? Is it accurate? Does it enforce the local rules of the country you happen to be in? Sometimes these things can get coded wrong, which is maybe why it's a security problem, because it's an incorrect thing. Maybe that's not just a quality assurance thing where it was a typo, but some of these rule enforcing or legal questions could result in seizures or inaccurate posting. And when something on a blockchain is inaccurate, it takes some effort to fix it. And that's why when we want to do a security assessment here, we certainly want to make sure that the pieces that humans built are actually safe to use and have integrity. And so kind of I ask my question here, right? When you are looking at this world, let's pretend for a minute that everything is becoming digital, right? We're removing the human from the flowchart. We're removing the bank. We're starting to automate all of these flows from end to end. You need to deliver features that are safe to use. And I don't mean they'll cause harm and things like that. I mean, they will be accurate all of the time, because people will need to trust these transactions. They might not get a choice whether to use a CBDC because they'll be a resident of a country that adopts one, but they still want to have the emotional and practical trust of that system. And I think that's what this security assessment helps show. But what does it actually do, right? When you look at a blockchain has many layers of technical stuff that makes it work. The foundational part of that technical system is the mathematics. You need to trust that the math will keep the information, the signature, practically safe. Often in the case of math, is the math strong enough to withstand the attack for the duration of time you need it to stand for? In the case of quantum, it's making it faster for the computer to compromise what the math is trying to prove. So you want to check to make sure that the math is sound, because this whole system is built on foundational math. That math is implemented in code. People build this code. We have to make sure that the code does the math right, especially in the world where we're inventing some of these new algorithms, putting these chains, these technologies into production for the very first time. That math better be implemented correctly in all of the use cases that it intends to. Quite often, some of this math works in academic papers, but it does not work when implemented for real, because there are practical reasons. There's language problems, there's cloud problems, there's local problems, there's country problems, there's key escrow problems, there's all these things that the real world applies upon academic math that you need to check with these sort of assessments. And these two foundational things, I would argue, have to be done by everybody when they're deploying these kind of systems. As we go through it, it gets more into the business logic there, right? Do I trust the sites that these technologies live in? Can I then trust the transactions going through them? It's money. So does the money go the right place? Do the right thing? But then there's people, right? Should you ever trust that a person gets it right 100% of the time? You can't, especially when you get to every possible person in your country. I don't know that I could trust every person to not lose their key or to, not lose an important password that gives them access to their money. Today in the traditional world, there are ways to do recovery operations. There are ways to get your money back if it is stolen in many cases. When there are humans and the public internet in the middle of these sort of security environments, you need to pull the human out and say, what if I can't trust any of the humans? Well, I need the math to do it right. Okay, well, how do I combine, a bunch of humans trying to break it, a bunch of humans misusing it, a bunch of humans not knowing what to do with this full scope of technically challenging things? Security assessment is going to help you look at that whole layer of things. And, whether or not you're going to be a bank who's going to adopt and advise CBDC country implementing this, you want to go all the way up the stack to make sure that you at least have an answer for these or a plan maybe, because you can't answer all of these questions all the time. You can't make this 100% safe. You can just make it usable to the point where you're willing to accept the risk of use it. So we do a lot of security assessments here at Kudelski globally. We audit CBDCs and we look at blockchains and we look at algorithms. We've been doing this for a lot of years now. But what's funny about it, we find the same stuff in almost every type of implementation. People use bad libraries. They trust bad dependencies, basic math errors. You add before you divide instead of divide before you add. These sorts of things are human error quite often. They're not technical problems. They're software build problems. When we look at these attacks that have happened over the last 10 years, the ones that compromise things the most, right? It compromises the person's password, secrets management. It compromises the way it was implemented, or it attacks one tiny little flaw. If anybody saw the log.js, issue from a couple of weeks ago, that was a tiny little flaw in a system. That was a software library essentially that everything depended upon. These are common scenarios that will also be in CBDCs. They will be in the systems that are used for these. And we have to go through these basic things because I think us as security practitioners, us as designers and architects need to at least think about these 6 things as we're building our system. How do I keep it current? How do I trust what I have there? How do I manage these secrets, these passwords, these keys? Because those are the keys to the kingdom. How do I make sure that the cryptography is good and that if something goes wrong, I can handle it? How do I handle that error when it does happen? Because it will happen. What is true in the blockchain world more than in this world is that there are brand new coders with brand new ideas who are crypto native folks. They haven't been doing this for 30, 40, 50 years like some of us, and they don't know these lessons of the past. And I think what we need to do, especially in some of these standards, especially as practitioners, is we need to make sure that we take some of the things that we have learned about the common flaws in the past as we've designed banking systems, tax systems and stuff, and make sure that those are also implemented in the theories and practices that we put on top of the blockchain system. People ask me a lot, right? When we do an assessment of these things, do they ask about privacy? Do they ask about quantum? And yeah, they do. What often they don't ask us to do is go break it, because I don't have a quantum computer and I can go break their system. But what I can do is help them think through the ways that privacy goes bad, the way that their key handling, their key management could go bad. Quantum cryptography, quantum attacks are a very interesting thing because you have to plan for it. Maybe today a quantum computer cannot break the math. Well, as far as I know, none of them can break the math. In 10 years, maybe it can break the math. So if I think I need a transaction life to last 1 second and it takes 1 year to break it, it's probably safe because we'll already have moved on to the next transaction. If I think I need to keep every transaction written safe, even if a quantum computer exists. And I need to keep, for instance, this information, for the history of time. At some point, a quantum computer will be able to look back at that historical data and decrypt it. Maybe that's okay, maybe that's not okay. But thinking through, that encrypted information that's written on the ledger that you are keeping private or safe, or, as somebody's private information or key, you're not going to want this quantum computer in 10 years to decrypt information from the past and use it to attack in the future. So these interesting timing problems really need to be thought through by the designers. And when you bring in an assessor, they have this skill, as I heard from Daniel, as we have here at Kudelski, like there are specialists here, Paul's a specialist in this. This math is hard. We need to bring in the people who understand, if this happens, then that happens. What do I do? How do I upgrade this? How do I ready to roll out new keys if suddenly we get attacked? These are really important things. And this will only exacerbate it as we move forward into the future here. As these quantum computers get closer and closer, we're going to start asking these questions. If a government is running my system and it traditionally takes them 10 years to upgrade their whole stack, how do I start upgrading so that I can catch the upgrade cycle? They have a 10-year upgrade cycle, but math goes at the speed of 3 years. They better start upgrading now. Maybe they need to start designing a system that can be updated now, but then updated in the future when it's ready, when we standardize on something. These are sort of the things that we have to think about here. We do a lot of advisory sessions right now with companies, traditional key managers, mathematicians, other academics, to talk about the practical risks of what we do about these sorts of things. It's funny because when I think about the seriousness of these issues, sometimes I wonder if we are taking this serious enough. We are still having password problems. People are still getting phished. People are still losing their money to somebody sending them a tweet or a telegram or an email. Like, why does that still happen? Isn't it silly that one click wipes out your entire, earning? We can't let that happen as we go through this experiment, as we implement these CBDCs, as we implement this for real as a digital environment. I think we need to make sure that we take this seriously and go through all the scenarios and use cases. I think one of the important things that these, workshops and people who are looking at this to design this, you need to ask, let's assume this happens. How do I render this safe? Like, how do I not create these sins of the past? Bring in an assessor, bring in a team, bring in some experts, and really truly think through this. One of the rules in cybersecurity is that you always lose to a nation state, right? There's always somebody with more money than you. There's always somebody with more resources than you. And if you're fighting against somebody with unlimited resources and unlimited money, they will find a way in. And in the case of CBDCs, they probably will compromise your key. They probably will take over an insider or a consumer. They probably will do a configuration change you don't expect, or they will find a flaw in that contract that was deployed. What is true here is you need to be able to handle that scenario. You need to know if a single person is compromised, it can't take over the whole system. If a single server or configuration or key is mismanaged, it can't drain everybody's wallet. You want to keep that attack surface, the impact of that, as small as possible, because what we don't want to happen is we don't want this to crash, right? I don't think a nation state can simply delete everybody's money and give it back if there's a flaw here. Maybe they could, but doesn't that sow huge amount of distrust if they were to simply say, oh, sorry, we screwed up, delete, here you go, it's back, but it's safe this time. So we have to think about this from the beginning, because these double spending problems that people talk about, if I could spend my $1 million twice online, that would be a problem. And we need to make sure that as we look at these unlimited money, unlimited resources attack scenarios, that we work through these ones that are essentially business ending for this kind of currency. When we think about what can be done to prepare against this, we think a lot about the algorithms, the safety of upgrades, the ability to manage. We also have to think about humans, human behavior, adopting this, the ability to track and control. Maybe this needs to be shut off for a minute to keep it safe. Maybe it needs to be open and audited and fully open source. We can't really future-proof anything. We can just make it such that you can safely manage it and upgrade it and roll forward. I think bringing in a quality assessor, surrounding yourself by experts, making sure that you're appropriately compensating the teams you bring in to stay with you, to learn and to grow. This technology is really immature, right? Banking has been around for a long time, hundreds of years, depending on how you count, thousands of years. This technology is at most 10 years old, 20 years old in academics. We still have some work to do, so we need to make sure that it is going to be safe. You can adopt strategies. We are going to bring in all of these things. I've said these. Make sure you implement preventative trolls in these systems, because sometimes you need to react in 0 seconds, because that's how fast digital money moves. It's gone, right? That's how fast these things. You can't just, hey, look, the money went, let's go get it back. That might not be a thing anymore. So we need to put these controls in the front. And the last thing I'll put in front of you is sort of this list of things you need to think about, right? There is a huge list of bullets that go into, how do I get advice? How do I test this? How do I build it right? How do I do R&D? These sort of bullets should hopefully give your brain some thought areas on, okay, if I need to build this, I'm going to need to be ready to do a smart contract review. I need to do tabletop exercises. I need to do a full stack architecture assessment and build it with the right people. All of these strategy topics should be somewhere in your book of materials and your plan as you design this. Companies like the Kudelski group can help there. Other researchers, organizations like ITU should be your partners in designing this. And with that, I will turn it back to more Q&A here as we continue on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott, for highlighting all these, what is the security assessment all about, and what are the different steps in the security assessment, what are the different dimensions that companies should consider, and also the different attack scenarios, how to address them. So now we'll move to the question and answer session. So as our audience is going to, like I said, the audience is invited to type their questions in the Q&A window that you see at the bottom of the screen. So as our audience is providing their questions, so let me maybe ask a few questions to the panelists. Let's go back to Daniel. So Paul, can you also turn on your video, please? So Daniel, you talk a bit about the security and privacy aspects of CBDCs and stable coins. Specifically with regards to stable coins and their applications, what would you say are the current challenges right now as far as privacy is concerned?
When it comes to CBDCs, I think there is a big pushback from government entities because privacy is usually the realm where authorities are very scared of going into when it comes to financial interactions. In terms of the technological advances, I think we can see at what happens today in the blockchain space. More and more applications and blockchains are kind of moving to a privacy model. There is a kind of a very default standard for how to implement those transactions privately, which comes at the amazing innovation of the Zcash team has done by using zero-knowledge proofs for that. And one of the things that they have showed as well is that you can kind of create a protocol where there's, for example, what they call viewing keys, where you have specific, permission-based keys that you can provide to, for example, an authority for them to purely see what is the transactions that you're doing, but not be able to act upon them, right? Or, for example, steal your funds, etc. So cryptography is very powerful here, and really, the space is ready for this. It's just a matter of kind of making sure that the users are putting enough pressure so that any CBDC that comes out will have inherently a privacy model built on it. It's important to have standards for adoption as well, because it's tricky. It's tricky to get the privacy right.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Paul now. So Paul, there is a lot of talk about countries working on unhackable satellite quantum system, and this is to protect against cyber warfare attacks, for example, on telecommunications networks through the electrical power grid, for instance. So how and why are they claiming that this is unhackable? What is the primary difference between satellite network communications and a traditional telecommunications network that we use today in terms of security? Can you elaborate a bit on this?
Sure, thank you. So as is always the case, whenever we hear terms like unhackable, we need to look carefully at the details and see what the claim applies to, what is or isn't being hacked or become unhackable. The essence of what you just described for quantum satellites is something called quantum key distribution, or QKD. We're going to call it QKD here quickly. If you're familiar with key-based cryptography algorithms and protocols, then you understand the principle that the security comes down to knowledge of the key ultimately, and therefore protection of the key. When two parties wish to protect their communications using key-based cryptography, they first need a mechanism to securely obtain those keys. In order to minimize the damage done by an attacker who compromises any specific key, it's customary in secure protocols, communication protocols, to generate keys dynamically, use them briefly, and then discard them. In practice, this means that two parties who are communicating over any non-trivial distance generally have to securely generate and distribute keys using infrastructure they must consider hostile and subject to being actively attacked. Their approach is to solve this problem based on classic cryptography that we rely on all the time, things like a TLS protocol. QKD, quantum key distribution, however, is a non-classical approach, and it takes advantage of the quantum properties of nature. More specifically, QKD takes advantage of something called the observer effect. The observer effect tells us that merely observing a quantum system can disturb the system. There's a lot more detail and complexity, obviously, than we can go into today. But the important thing to take away is that the two parties using QKD can detect if they're being attacked while arriving on a key that they will use to encrypt their communications. So if they detect that attack before they use the key, they don't use the key, the bad guy doesn't have the key. It's a fascinating approach to the problem, but it brings problems of its own. One of those are serious technical challenges as the distance between the two parties increases. So to get to the satellite part now, when people talk about unhackable satellite quantum systems, they are almost certainly referring to some recent work from China, use a satellite between two parties to enable much, much longer distances than we've seen with approaches up to now to use quantum key distribution. The most fascinating thing to me about their work was that their approach did not require even trusting the satellite at all. As one of the scientists said in an interview, is you could use your enemy's satellite. It's pretty cool. It's impressive stuff. Now, does all this mean that things are suddenly unhackable in some overall blanket sense and the world is great forever? No, it's not really. But I'd characterize it as a very important achievement, because for the pieces of the complex system that this new technology encompasses, it makes some very compelling security claims. Things only get better. It's cool stuff.
Okay, thank you. Maybe now to Scott. How practical would it be to use, QKD, for example, in the cryptocurrency industry?
Well, right this second, it's not practical at all. At some point in the future, we are going to start making some decisions on technical difficulty of implementation versus time it takes to upgrade that once we get it installed versus what the attacker will do if we make it unhackable. Right? A lot of this tricks with math, as I mentioned earlier, is about time to break the algorithm versus the amount of time the data or transaction has to exist. Right? If the existence is less than time to break, you're mostly safe. But if this data is around for 50 years, then it's going to be important. And today that's impractical to deal with. But if it ever gets practical to attack this stuff, we're going to have to be able to upgrade really quickly. Maybe we'll have to rotate your blockchain keys every 1 second, or maybe if it never becomes practical, the bad guys will simply break it. As wouldn't the layman ask, well, if observing something quantum breaks it, well, let's just observe it all the time and it's just broken all the time. And that's not what we mean. But as scientists, we use words like that. And so we need to be able to handle questions like that. I'll just break the satellite. How do I break a satellite? Well, I'll mess with the communications. I'll go to the desk that controls the satellite. I'll crash it if it's a low Earth one. I'll, upgrade bad firmware. I won't break the math anymore because that's the hard part. I'll start breaking all the other little tiny things along the way. I'll compromise the human because that might be the easiest thing. That might be the most practical attack in the future, because today it's impractical to attack the math. It will still be impractical for a while. It will be a lot more practical to attack the weakest link, which is probably the person or probably the password or probably some system in between.
Okay, thank you. So will we be ever safe?
Well,
for all the panelists, what's your...
We're always, mostly safe today, because there's generally an undo button in life for a lot of monetary things, depending on where you live in the world. That's important as we answer these questions around CBDCs, is how to keep people safe, even if there is an event, and monetarily safe, I think we talk about here. So I think we're, smart to keep it that way, and we will be able to protect the vast majority of situations in the vast majority of places. Of course, there are always edge cases where we have to accept the risk. Today you can get mugged in the street. Tomorrow you will maybe still get your password compromised. Thankfully, that's 10 people a day in a city of 1 million. Okay, let's still make it 10 passwords a day in a population of 1 million, right? Let's not make it any worse.
Yeah, if I could add, one term that's come into its own in the last few years in the cyber industry is this thing called cyber resiliency. And I really like what Scott just said. And to me, I think it's really a reflection of that if you adopt cyber resiliency principles, the most important of which is that you assume bad things are going to happen. You don't fool yourself. You're not one of these naive people. If you're, to use this term, if you're resiliency native, design it in, then yeah, bad things will happen. And so you design in your undo button. It's as simple as planning for that resiliency to need to be there.
I think it's interesting, sort of two points that I want to add. Like when we talk here about an undo button, well, it really depends, right? We've been shown in this new space of blockchain that undo doesn't necessarily do better. I mean, when you need to, take back the Ethereum blockchain a few blocks because $150 million have been stolen from a smart contract, not everybody will be happy. And then you create two different blocks. I mean, like, there is, plenty of things here to consider. But I do agree in that sense that we need to make sure that there is a way to, allow for human error. And I think that's the key point that these systems need to capture. There is a different definition of what safe means, which is not only in the usability aspect, but in the kind of non-usability. Like, what happens if we don't have these systems, right? Like, we keep thinking about these human errors and about money being stolen, but what about censorship? Like, we are, I guess most of us here, maybe some people in the audience, are not necessarily lucky to be, in developed or democratic countries, and this can have serious consequences on the financial freedom or freedom of speech of many people, and that's also why I think enabling privacy needs to take a priority, because it will enable everyone to use these systems without feeling unsafe from using those systems, right? So I think it's important to consider all aspects of what safety means, and of course safety of the assets is imperative for these systems to be adopted. So yeah, I think we are in the right direction though. This is important. I mean, as long as we recognize that we are still in the early stages of these things, of these systems, we allow ourselves to make a little bit more mistakes, at least in the innovation part of it. Also, I will say that a lot of the kind of money that is being used in those systems today were printed in those systems. I mean, it's not the usual money that governments have been issuing for years. There is, of course, a lot of that because that's part of the industries and the institutions that are coming in. But as long as a new token is created and suddenly there is a lot more value, then it's okay, more okay to be more risky with that with those funds.
Okay, thank you everyone for your response here. Let's maybe focus a bit on the privacy issues and also the auditability of digital assets and data. So Daniel, in your opinion, what are some of the trade-offs that exist between privacy and auditability of digital assets and data, and maybe also how can cryptography optimize maybe both at the same time? And feel free, maybe Scott, if you want to jump in on that as well.
A great question, Vijay. So as I was trying to explain earlier in my presentation, usually when in the traditional sense, when we think about auditability of transactions and financial data, we think about kind of pushing all of the transactions and all of these data to, let's say, a third party, right? Like it would be like specific auditing companies, right? And this inherently subverts the privacy because you're really literally giving all your information to a third party. And the excuse of, well, if you want to hide something, it may mean that you are doing something wrong, is not enough to really subvert all the privacy of the data of an institution, let alone like of an individual and let alone of an institution, right? And so when we think about using cryptography, the power of cryptography is not only that it can actually provide privacy on basic applications or basic usage, and even in decentralized systems, but that it can actually enable these authorities to get the kind of auditability that they need from the systems just by getting a certified check or a verification of a proof or a result from a multi-party computation that at the end of the day relies on mathematics to say that it's okay, right? So finding a way to, on the one hand, kind of appease for these regulators and authorities to be able to use these systems, to trust these systems legally speaking, because this is also an issue, the legality aspect, right? How can you use a zero knowledge proof in court? Well, today it probably can't. Nobody has tried it, I don't think. There's also papers on this, by the way. This is really interesting field. But, convincing, the authorities to use these techniques and accept just the way that they would accept, say, an okay from a third party that is trusted by them, they would be able to accept an okay or a check from a cryptographic, output. And on the other hand, having the users, be able to ensure their privacy, also trusting the math, right? But at the end of the day, depending on the math, so that they can feel free and safe to use these systems.
Maybe to add on top of what the general perception of people have today, and it's if you're not doing anything bad, why do you care about being private? Well, there's just some things that should be private. If I give my kid $1, nobody needs to know why I gave them $1, that I gave them $1, right? That's just a benign activity. But there's actually some laws that most people agree are good to enforce. If I gave somebody $1, nobody cares. If I gave them $1 500 million times, maybe they would suddenly say, why did you do that? That's a little bit out of the norm. And so when you look at what people consider private, it really means, private unless it hits the edge case where it might be suspect of terrorism or money laundering or something that is considered illegal in your jurisdiction. Of course, we have to really think about the idea of a fully monitored society versus a fully closed society and the practical implications of letting anything go versus nothing go. Maybe it is the case that my dollar digital transaction goes through a system which gives it the little sniff test, and it decides at some point if I have crossed the bar of maybe I shouldn't be private anymore, they need to take a closer look. maybe I've done enough transactions where it decides that maybe this should be taxable instead of not, right? These are computer systems that will have to make these decisions going forward. But in general, these technologies have to have the option to keep it fully private, maybe have the option to keep it fully anonymous, but maybe completely undone in the case where something bad is happening, right? We all around the world have different definitions of bad. There's a couple of things that we generally all agree are really bad, exploitation use cases, terrorism use cases, and such. So we can generally agree that it's a good idea to have a rule to enforce some of those things. But then against the normal citizen, we only turn those on if the law gets involved in the right places. And these things are really tricky if then else clauses to implement in programs. If you live in this country, but then you're this and you're not at this and you're going to do this, but you're only doing this with that. Like, come on, that's just an M to M to M problem, I call it, which is got so many different permutations, you can't possibly design them all. So design for the edge cases on some of these privacy questions, right? It's kind of a sloop.
Okay, maybe one more question to Daniel on the privacy enhancing techniques that you mentioned in your presentation, and also the need for digital identity. So in your presentation, I think what we didn't see was, how can privacy enhancing techniques maybe reshape the field of self-sovereign identity, like, for example, enabling individuals to own their digital identities. So what's the what's the role of privacy?
So digital identities, right? Digital identity is a big topic, right? I mean, if you look at, for example, the Web3 Foundation, who's been taken out of like these DIDs, right? We're called digital identifiers, yeah. And they've been basically thinking about what are called credentials, right? So credentials are basically the way that we are now kind of imagining identity working in the digital space, where essentially, you go to the DMV to get your driving license, and instead of getting like a little card, you're going to get a credential online where you can access it from your application and whatnot. And anybody later who needs to kind of check your driving license will maybe just like check, a QR code, for example, for a driving license. Well, credentials can also take a step further. And actually zero knowledge, for example, zero knowledge proofs can help you even more. Let's say that instead of, doing a QR code of your ID, where maybe some information may display or something like this, you're going to go into your ID in the application and say, tap once and say, what property do you want to prove out of your ID? Maybe you want to prove your date of birth. Maybe you want to prove your, expiration date of your license, maybe the type of license, et cetera, et cetera. And this can work, for many types of credentials, your university credentials, like knowledge, skills, work, identities, like government identities, issues, or even, your actual, interaction with certain businesses. It could be, logging in, for example. You are a specific identity. The biggest issue there is to make sure that you have a way to kind of allow for a single, for all this information to be tied to a single identity, right? Because usually when you're thinking about self-sovereign identity, these identities are kind of also a little bit siloed per system. Like if I think about my identity, for example, in the Ethereum blockchain, well, I have several addresses, I may have NFTs, I may use some DeFi platforms, etc. But then if I go to the Bitcoin blockchain, that's a different identity, right? So how can I sort of manage all these identities and all this data that is being created? And, just to throw another hype word, if we talk about the metaverse, this is going to be imperative to whatever the metaverse looks like. But, we know that identity is going to be key in there. So yeah, doing this in a way that is private, like why do I need to show all my information, when it's being asked, and how do I get these things issued? it's a big field. I mean, it covers a lot.
One thing to add to that is, on the internet, there's that joke, nobody on the internet knows you're a dog. There are times when you need to be a legal persona. There are times you want to be, the knight with the sword. And having these digital identifiers allows you to choose which persona to have, depending on if it's legal or not legal. And I think that's the most interesting thing about it. There's a practical security implications of having a digital ID that's a little too open, though, is how do I know that Scott's digital ID is actually being used by Scott? Like, we have to start combining some other things in ways that start to make people a little emotionally weird. Like, it's great if I use my digital ID at the liquor store to buy because they know I'm 21 and they scan my QR code. But how do they know that's me? Do I implant that in a tracking chip? Do they watch my phone as I come from my house? Do they combine a bunch of other information about me? Okay, he just, flew on a plane and now he's in this place, and so it's probably him. Like, these sorts of things have to be decided in a computer versus holding up the little card that says I'm old enough. Sometimes we are going to have a hard time actually implementing something that works in every use case.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for these comments. So we're also coming now to the end of the session. So very quickly, let me just summarize a bit the key takeaways today. So we've seen, the different, I would say maybe vulnerabilities, of the blockchain, and also the threat of the quantum computing, that was mentioned by Paul, and also maybe how privacy enhancing techniques can also address, the privacy issues that we face with blockchains, and with using them in CBDCs and stable coins. And then we've heard also about the importance of doing security assessments to make sure, that the system is actually doing the right thing, and it's actually, respecting, the security best practices, and protecting and preserving confidentiality, integrity, and is also available all the time. So we've gone through, a number of these issues during the session, and also highlighted, some of the maybe the remedial actions that are there that can be considered by organizations. And now I'd like to, before we close the session, we'd like to inform you, that the DC3 conference continues again this afternoon. So we'll be live again in the next 30 minutes or so. And the next session of the security track is going to be the deep dive session on the digital currency validation for protection and resilience, which will talk a bit about, a security a validation model on how we would assess, security of different digital currency types. And this is a work that's being done under the Security and Assurance Working Group of the Digital Currency Global Initiative. So we hope to see you all in the next session to maybe discuss a bit, how the validation model that's being discussed at the DC3 will help address some of those security threats that we discussed in this session. So I'd like also to mention that the recording of this session will be available later today on the website. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for their participation in today's session, and also for taking the time to share their insights and experience. I would like to wish you all a very pleasant day, and thank you all for your attention. And this session is now closed. So thanks everyone, and bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.